He roared like a monster of steel and flew faster than any sound the war had ever heard. Its appearance on the battlefield defied all laws of physics and logic, a jet fighter in a place where yesterday only piston propellers ruled. They spoke of it in whispers, hid it from allies, and guarded it even from their own pilots. Its engines exploded, its designers were scorched by the exhaust, and the government feared the enemy would steal even the shadow of its blueprints. But it was this aircraft that became the point from which the world transitioned into a new era, an era where the sky no longer belonged to man, but only to speed. And the way it was born is a story of genius, despair, and madness that people long hesitated to talk about. Dust, soot, and the roar of guns. Infantry marched across the scorched fields of Europe, tired faces, explosions in the distance. Suddenly, a roar tears through the front line, a sound unlike any other sound of war. Not the whine of a piston engine, nor the drone of a propeller, but a steady metallic wail, as if the air itself had ignited. A silver shadow sweeps over the trenches, sleek, bladeless, with flames erupting from its tail. This was the Meteor, the first jet fighter of the Allied coalition, appearing where it could not possibly be. It flies over the infantry, leaving a trail of fire, and those who see it for the first time cannot believe their eyes. A machine of the future in the thick of a war of the past. How could Britain, a nation exhausted by bombings, create something like this? How did engineers, surrounded by bureaucracy and lacking support and resources, manage to wrest decades of progress from time? The answer begins far from the front, in quiet workshops, where the smell of kerosene mixed with the smoke of soldering irons. And one man's dream became the engine of a new era. His name was Frank Whittle, a humble British officer, pilot, and engineer who dared to think what even the best minds in aviation wouldn't: that piston engines were a dead end, and that it shouldn't be a propeller cutting the air, but the sheer force of burning gas capable of pushing a machine forward. In the early 30s, he was a loner who was misunderstood. When he brought his design for a gas turbine engine to the Air Ministry, they laughed at him. In their eyes, it was madness. Who would want to fly on fire? But Whittle didn't give up. He patented the idea, founded a tiny company called Power Jets, and began building the engine with money from private investors who believed in him more than his own government. He worked nights, drawing, soldering, and testing himself. The first prototype, assembled in '37, barely started and immediately broke down. The compressor melted, the bearings crumbled, and everything was covered in soot and grime. But for Whittle, this wasn't a failure, but proof that the dream could spin. He kept working, even when funding dried up and engineers left one by one. By mid-38, he was noticed by Gloster Aircraft, a small aircraft factory in Brockworth, where designer George Carter was looking for fresh ideas. Whittle offered him not just an engine, but a revolution, and Carter realized he had a once-in-a-century opportunity. Thus began what would later be called the birth of the jet age. But back then, in the late 30s, it all looked like madness. Britain was still living with propellers and radiators, while Whittle and Carter dreamed of a sky free from the noise of pistons, where aircraft would cut through the air with pure flame. They worked in conditions where every detail was handcrafted, even kerosene was hard to come by, and every engine start was a gamble with fate. Yet, despite poverty, fear, and distrust, the fire beneath the turbine casing flared up again. The machine, born in the shadow of despair, came alive for the first time, and the air trembled with a new force. It was only the first step, fragile, barely noticeable, but it was the start of the story of an aircraft that was destined to change the concept of flight forever. In the sky of the future, a low, steady drone was already audible, a harbinger of a new era, where one man's dream became the symbol of an entire nation. And when the world didn't yet know the word jet, Whittle wasn't just building an engine, he was building time. A young Royal Air Force officer stood before the committee, holding blueprints that seemed like science fiction to them. In an era where the sky belonged to propellers and the noise of engines was the music of progress, he spoke of flight without blades, of a machine pushed forward by a stream of fire. The committee members listened politely, then exchanged glances. Their faces held a mixture of condescending smiles and cautious disbelief. One of them said, "Interesting, but unfeasible." This was Frank Whittle's first encounter with what would later be called the Wall of the Empire, the cold machine of British bureaucracy that crushed even the boldest ideas. He was more than just an engineer, a fanatic, a dreamer, a man whose eyes lit up at the sight of fuel that could be made to work differently. At just 23, he wrote a thesis on a new type of propulsion system. His idea was terrifyingly simple. Let air be compressed by a compressor, mixed with fuel, explode, and burst out, creating jet thrust. It seemed like magic, not engineering. When it became clear that there would be no support, he decided to go it alone, sold everything he could, and opened the small firm Power Jets. A modest room, a few workbenches, second-hand tools, and a team of enthusiasts who believed not in success, but in him. They worked sleeplessly, fueled by cold tea and obstinacy. Metal melted, bolts flew out, turbines shattered into pieces. Every test ended in smoke and soot, but Frank just wiped his face and said, "One more time." Private investors, seeing his obsession, contributed money almost out of pity. The state remained silent. Departments believed such ideas could only exist on paper. Whittle increasingly faced ridicule. Why does Britain need a cannon that flies? But he didn't know how to retreat. Every time the engine exploded, he saw it not as an end, but as a clue. Years passed, but the result was still elusive. His friends began to doubt. He himself sometimes looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man with burned hands and a weary gaze. All he had left was the faith that one day the metal would hold and the fire beneath the casing would not go out. And just when it seemed that even the sky's patience was wearing thin, fate sent him a man who saw not madness, but meaning. George Carter, the chief engineer at GLR Aircraft, heard about the strange officer tinkering with a crazy engine. Carter was older, more experienced, but within him lived the same thirst for the impossible. They met in the laboratory, where the smell of oil and ozone hung heavy. Whittle showed him the blueprints, spoke of thrust, of the turbine, of a future without propellers. Carter was silent for a long time, looking at the diagram, then quietly said, "This is not just an engine, this is the beginning of a new era." From that moment, one man's dream became a two-person mission. The Empire did not yet know that its aviation had already entered the battle for the future, not against the enemy, but against its own disbelief. When Carter and Whittle started working together, no one understood what they were planning. At the Brockworth airfield, where old propeller-driven Gladiators with canvas coverings stood in the hangars, a drone suddenly appeared that no one had ever heard before. Not the rumble of a motor, not the unfamiliar chatter of cylinders, but the dry, heavy breathing of steel and flame. Where others saw smoke and failure, they saw the future. The collaboration between GLR Aircraft and Power Jets began not with victories, but with burns and scorched workshops. The first jet engine, the E.1, was a monster of metal and pipes that roared when started. It was assembled by hand on the floor under a lamp, where the tools heated up so much they had to be held with a rag. When the engine first came to life, the entire team stood in a daze. The noise was like a volcano waking up in the hangar. After a few seconds, the compressor seized and everything exploded. Flame erupted, alarms sounded, and the ceiling was covered in soot. But for Whittle, this was not a failure. He simply said, "It breathed." His nights with Carter were like days, filled with the noise of welding, the smell of kerosene, and desperate faith. No one knew exactly what they were creating, a weapon or a symbol. Every new start was a leap in the dark. If the compressor worked, they celebrated. If it exploded, they drew again. Carter believed that something bigger could be built from this, not just an engine, but an aircraft that would not fear speed. Thus was born the Pioneer, a small, strange monoplane without a propeller, with clipped wings and tiny landing gear. They nicknamed it Whittle's Monster. No one believed this machine could even get off the ground. But in May 1941, at the Gloucestershire airfield, the wind was calm, and Whittle and Carter stood side by side, watching the pilot prepare for the first test. When the engine roared, the sound was inhuman. The air trembled, the concrete beneath their feet vibrated. The Pioneer moved, gained speed, and suddenly lifted off. For a second, it seemed to hang in the air, then smoothly ascended. No smoke, no crackle, just the steady roar of flame cutting the morning silence. The people on the ground were silent. No one applauded, no one shouted. They simply watched as a man ascended into the sky for the first time, not on blades, but on the force of fire. The flight lasted a few minutes. The machine returned, wobbling slightly, and landed, as if it didn't believe it had done it. Soot still smoked on the wings, and there were grime marks on the fuselage. But for those standing nearby, it was a moment of revelation. For the first time, the air was held by a stream of flame, not a propeller. For the first time, man felt that speed could be infinite. Whittle stood silently, pressing his hands to his face. His eyes shone, not from the light, but from the fact that the dream they had laughed at was now roaring over the earth. Carter walked over and quietly said, "Now, the real work begins." They didn't yet know that thousands of errors awaited them, explosions, breakdowns, and despair. But that sound, the steady metallic wail of the W1 engine, had already become the voice of a new era. The sky smelled of kerosene, not gasoline, for the first time. And that smell would remain in history forever. Initial successes emboldened them, but it quickly became clear that the miracle wouldn't be repeated. The Pioneer was a proof of concept, but not a weapon. It flew, yes, but like a fragile dragonfly, incapable of fighting. One engine was simply not enough. An aircraft with guns, armor, and fuel would never get off the ground. And then Carter realized they needed not one heart, but two. This thought was almost blasphemous. In an era when every kilogram of metal was precious, and factories struggled to produce conventional aircraft, he proposed building a twin-engine jet interceptor. 2 blazing turbines, 1 wing, a fighter capable not just of flying, but of chasing the enemy like a whirlwind. On the blueprints, everything looked clean and simple. 2 engines on the wings, a pilot in a pressurized cockpit, 6 cannons in the nose. But the reality was different. Design councils turned into a battlefield. Some said such a machine would fall apart from its own heat, others that the fuel couldn't be supplied fast enough. A third demanded a return to proven piston designs. Carter stood firm. He understood that this was the only way. Blueprints multiplied. Engines were sketched in the fuselage, under the belly, on the wings. There were dozens of options. The final choice was almost accidental. Engine nacelles on the wings provided better access to the engines and avoided vibrations. But even this decision was like a leap into the unknown. Metal melted, fastenings broke, and calculations showed one thing. Until the engines became more powerful, there could be no talk of flight. While Carter and his team debated the wing shape and cannon placement, Britain was burning. London lived by the wail of sirens, factories were bombed, but on the outskirts, in the Gloster workshops under the drone of alarms, the fighter of the future was being born. It existed only on paper, but every line of the blueprint felt like a thirst for speed and power. The pilot had to sit in a pressurized cockpit, like in a submarine. This was an idea ahead of its time, a high-altitude suit, enclosed glazing, the ability to fly above the clouds. Carter called him a man in the sky, not in the metal. 6 cannons were located in the nose, 2 beneath the cockpit, and 4 on the sides. The recoil was monstrous, but there was simply no other way to stop the German bombers. The project was designated G41 and received an official assignment from the Air Ministry. The signed paper felt almost sacred. Britain gave the green light to the first combat jet fighter, but this decision was not the end of the journey. It was the start of the struggle. Problems piled up one after another. Subcontractors couldn't keep up, parts didn't fit together. During testing, the rear wing spar broke, and Carter had to completely change the design. Light alloys were replaced with alloy steel. The plane became heavier, but stronger. The most terrible part lay ahead, the engines. They simply did not exist in the required form. Whittle and Power Jets were still struggling with the W2 model, and Rover, which was entrusted with production, was missing deadlines. Sometimes, finished fuselages stood in the workshops without engines, like bodies without hearts. Britain at that moment lived between fear and hope. German Messerschmitts dominated the sky, and the Allies desperately needed a miracle. Carter knew that if they didn't succeed, the future would belong to the enemy. Night after night, he sat over the blueprints, reworking every line. Sometimes the sheets were stained with coffee and cigar soot. This all resembled an act of desperation, a struggle for survival rather than a project. Yet, beneath the layers of paper, metal, and fatigue, a shape emerged. A sleek fuselage, a raised stabilizer, powerful wings, and on them, two huge nacelles, like two hearts ready to come alive. This silhouette would become a symbol of the new century, but back then it was just a dream encapsulated in blueprints. While sirens wailed outside the factory windows, Carter stood by the model and quietly said, "When they work together, the world will never be the same." The sky over Britain was ablaze. Luftwaffe bombers flew over London almost every night, and the country was on alert. People slept in cellars, and engineers slept right in the factories, where motors hummed instead of lullabies. The world was crumbling, but it was then that Great Britain decided to do the impossible: create a jet fighter that would change the course of the war. Between 41 and 43, everything turned into a race against time and fate. Factories couldn't keep up, metal arrived defective, parts didn't fit. Engineers worked under the drone of sirens, when the lights were turned off to avoid attracting the attention of German bombers. In Gloster aircraft, the lamps and the souls of the people burned, people who understood that if they were late, the sky would remain with the enemy. Every day brought a new challenge. The engines, assembled by Rover, exploded on the test stands. Compressors burned out, bearings melted. One engine fell apart during inspection, leaving behind only a scorched stand and the smell of kerosene. Meanwhile, Rolls-Royce tried to take over the production and refinement of the motors. De Havilland was creating its own version, the Goblin. The entire country seemed to have turned into a laboratory where engineers played with fire, with no room for error. Carter lived between blueprints and telegrams. News of losses came from the front, and news of failures came from the factories. He wrote to Whittle, demanding at least one working engine, and Whittle replied that the metal was cracking, the pressure wouldn't hold, the turbines sang, but it wouldn't fly. Their letters were like reports from the front line. Only the enemy was not man, but time. Each passing day brought the country closer to disaster, but in Brockworth, they stubbornly assembled the first Meteor. Workers riveted the fuselage, not knowing if they would ever see it take to the sky. Landing gear stood in the workshops without motors, empty nacelles, like bodies without hearts. When two finished engines finally arrived, they were greeted like saviors. Men in oil-stained overalls with dark circles under their eyes watched as they were lifted to the wings and were silent. In that silence was everything: fear, pride, hope. Spring 1943. At Cranwell Airfield, the morning fog lay low over the runway. Technicians checked bolts, topped up fuel, as if preparing not for a flight, but for a miracle. Pilot Michael Daunt stood next to the machine, running his hand over the smooth metal of the fuselage. He knew he was going into the unknown. No one had ever flown such a machine. It could stall, catch fire, or explode right on takeoff, but it could also become the start of a new era. The engines started. Quietly at first, then louder. The air trembled, the ground vibrated, and the sound was unlike any engine in the world. Not a roar, not a crackle, a rhythmic wail, heavy and deep, as if a beast inside the metal was preparing to break out. People covered their ears, and Carter watched, unblinking. The Meteor moved. The runway stretched endlessly. The roar intensified, and suddenly, liftoff. The machine ascended, leaving a white trail behind it. At that moment, the silence was replaced by shouts. Some applauded, some simply stood in a daze. For the first time in history, Great Britain saw its jet aircraft take to the sky. The flight was short, 15 minutes, no more. When the pilot returned and shut down the engines, he didn't leave the cockpit for a long time. His hands were shaking. He said only two phrases: "It flies, and it's not a plane. It's a beast." Carter listened and couldn't utter a word. He looked at the Meteor, still warm from the fire, and understood. They had snatched the sky from time. Britain had gained a weapon that could change the course of the war. But no one knew yet that this victory was only the beginning. The last winter of the war thundered over Europe. The Allies advanced onto the continent, but the sky remained dangerous, especially at night when the E.1 buzz bombs carrying death to London took off from German bases. They couldn't be stopped by fighters or anti-aircraft guns. Too fast, too small, too stubborn. Britain needed an answer, and that answer was already standing in the hangars. A new aircraft, resembling a steel arrow without a propeller. Its name was the Meteor. The 616 Squadron of the Royal Air Force received these machines first. Its pilots were veterans who survived the Battle of Britain, aces accustomed to Spitfires. When they were shown the jet fighter, many looked on with caution. Too strange, too new. No familiar whine of the propeller, no tremor of the fuselage, only the quiet wail of the turbines and the smell of kerosene, as if from another era. Command issued a strict prohibition: no crossing the English Channel. No one was to see the new aircraft until it had proven its reliability. Pilots were only allowed to operate over England, intercepting the V-1s. Missions were kept secret even within the bases. Sentries stood at the airfields with orders to shoot anyone who approached without authorization. The first sorties were full of tension. The jet engine droned smoothly, but the pilots constantly expected a hitch. What if the engine stalled in the air? What if the wing couldn't handle the speed? When Michael Daunt, the one who first flew the Meteor, prepared the young pilots for their flights, he said, "It's not a plane, it's fire with wings. Don't restrain it. Trust it." In July 1944, the order came to begin combat use. 14 Meteors took to the air from Culmhead Base. Their target was the V-1s heading for London from the coast. Gray streaks of smoke in the sky, the drone of turbines, nervous silence on the radio, and suddenly the first target, a small dot with a characteristic buzzing sound. The Hispano cannons jam, the sight is off, the rocket flies ahead. It was then that one of the pilots, Sergeant Charles Dixie Dean, decided on an act of madness. He brought the Meteor almost right up to the V-1. To his left, the flame from the missile's exhaust. To his right, cloud fragments. He leveled the machine and gently slipped the tip of his wing under the missile's plane. One touch, and a miracle. The missile flipped, lost control, and plummeted to the ground. An explosion, a column of smoke. The radio was silent for a few seconds. Then someone said, "He shot it down without firing a shot." This episode instantly became a legend. Newspapers didn't write about it, but rumors spread to all the bases. Pilots looked at the Meteor differently now. The machine no one had trusted had proven it could defeat the weapon of vengeance. It didn't just fly faster than everyone else, it did the impossible. The 616 Squadron became the Allies' first operational jet unit. They flew at night, without searchlights, without fanfare. The combat logs contained dry entries: 2 targets intercepted, 3 V-1s destroyed. But hidden behind these numbers was something greater: the birth of a new era in the sky. When the Meteors returned to base, silence fell over the airfield. Only the rhythmic drone of the turbines resonated in their chests. Pilots climbed out of the cockpits with faces black from soot, but in their eyes was the same spark only pioneers knew. They understood. The world had seen not just a new machine, but a future that arrived too early. And somewhere beyond the clouds across the channel, Me-262s, the enemy's first jet fighters, already stood in German hangars. They hadn't met in battle yet, but the sky already sensed a new duel was coming: man against machine, future against past. A strange silence hung over the English Channel. Where the sky used to roar with battles, a pause now reigned, as if history itself was holding its breath. The 2 most advanced aircraft on the planet were in the air: the British Gloster Meteor and the German Messerschmitt Me-262. They were born by different hands on different ends of Europe, but with a single purpose: to prove that speed could subdue war. Yet they never met face to face. Their duel, which the whole world awaited, never took place. The reason was fear, not the fear of defeat, but the fear of losing a secret. Allied command knew that if even one Meteor fell in occupied territory, the enemy would have a chance to study the jet engine. And Germany, which was already ahead of everyone in technology, could use this against the British themselves. Therefore, the pilots of 616 Squadron were strictly forbidden from crossing the channel. They could only see the French coast from altitude, but they were not allowed to fly there. Those sitting in the Meteor cockpits felt they were between 2 worlds, the old and the new. They were no longer just pilots. They became the first students in a school where they were taught not the speed of sound, but the fear of the void. Their flights turned into training against an invisible enemy. In the air, they practiced maneuvers no one knew yet: turns at jet speeds, minimum thrust pursuits, false dives from which only instinct could save them. RAF headquarters created secret methods for countering the Me-262 should it appear. They developed schemes for tangential passes, attacks from under the clouds, and synchronous interceptions. All that would later become the standard for jet warfare. Every Meteor flight became an experiment. They were testing not just the aircraft, but the man. Could he withstand the G-forces when time compressed and space trembled with speed? Intelligence reported alarming news. The Germans were already using the Me-262 against Allied bombers. These machines were faster, deadlier, but few in number. Encrypted dispatches flew between headquarters and airfields. Contact possible. But the order remained the same. Do not cross the border. Britain was protecting its future even from victory. Engineers in Farnborough and Gloucester worked in the shadows. Every engine removed was sent for dismantling. Every flight was recorded down to the second. A new science was born from these observations: high-speed aerodynamics. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone understood. The war would end, but the sky would never be the same. Meteor pilots became the first instructors in a world that was just beginning. They taught novices to fly not by instruments, but by feel, to seek the enemy not with their eyes, but to predict his trajectory when speed rendered sight useless. Their machines no longer participated in dogfights, but every sortie was part of the invisible battle for the future. Sometimes, standing by the runway, they would see the trail of a Me-262 in the west, a thin silver line in the sky. It disappeared before anyone could even start an engine. In those moments, the channel became the border of two eras. On one side, the past with pistons and blades. On the other, the future, burning with the flame of turbines. And although fate did not bring them together in battle, every pilot knew the meeting would happen anyway, not on the front, but in the memory of humanity, where two fiery aircraft never clashed in the air but forever divided history into before and after. When the cannonade of the war finally ceased, the sky changed. Where Spitfires and Messerschmitts recently roared, the steady drone of turbines now sounded, soft and heavy, as if space itself had learned to breathe anew. The jet age began quietly, without parades, but every morning the world's airfields woke up to this new sound. In Brockworth, where it all started, assembly lines hummed again. Now, not under the threat of bombs, but under the calls of engineers whose ideas had finally been set free. The Gloster Meteor became a symbol of a new Britain, tired but unbroken. The first modifications, the F-McI and F-McA3, still smelled of war, but by 1945, the F-McA with shortened wings, a reinforced fuselage, and new Rolls-Royce Derwent engines rolled onto the runways. This machine broke the world speed record, exceeding 960 km/h. The world, which only yesterday measured flight by the speed of pistons, now saw man approaching the sound barrier. The Meteors did not remain just a British miracle. They were sold to Belgium, Argentina, the Netherlands, Egypt, Denmark. They were in service with a dozen countries, becoming the first international school of jet aviation. In every new country, pilots climbed into their cockpits and felt the same thing Whittle and Carter once did: the vibration of metal, the smell of kerosene, the feeling that time itself was accelerating beneath the wings. Next came the FMK-8 Night Fighter, NF-11, etc. Longer, heavier, faster. It was fitted with an ejection seat, a gyroscopic sight, and the latest Derwent 8 engines. It flew almost at the speed of sound and became a symbol of technological independence for many nations. In those years, the Meteor was no longer fighting. It was training, testing, record-breaking, helping others understand what it was like to command fire. But what was most important was not how many machines were built or which countries owned them. The main thing was that this aircraft proved that the world had forever left the age of blades. Since then, the sky ceased to belong to wood and steel and became the domain of fire and thought. Frank Whittle lived through his triumph in silence. His invention became commonplace. George Carter, standing by a new prototype, once said, "Everything we did was just a step," and it truly was a step from the impossible to the obvious. Every spark, every engine explosion, every sleepless night in cold workshops became the bricks of a road leading to the future. The Meteor was not the most perfect, nor the most beautiful, but it was the first to prove that the sky was ready for change. When its engines droned at dawn, it seemed that history itself was taking off. The jet age began quietly, but forever. And everything that followed, from supersonic fighters to ships traversing space, began when one man believed that flame could lift man into the sky.